Hey everybody, Rex Bear here with Leak Project. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us this edition. We have Michael Heiser, a scholar in the fields of biblical studies and the ancient Near East. He is also the scholar in residence at Logos Bible Software. He earned an MA and PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic language at the University of Wisconsin-Madison back in 2004. He's also earned an MA in Ancient History from the University of Pennsylvania and major fields Ancient Israel and Egyptology. Mike can do translation work in roughly a dozen ancient languages, among them Biblical Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, Egyptian, hieroglyphs, Ugaritic, cuneiform. His academic specializations include Israelite religion, especially Israel's divine council. Mike has authored over 100 articles in both scholarly journals and publications designed for anyone. He is also the author of the Faith Life Study Bible, notes for the Old Testament books of Genesis through Judges. He is also the creator of several of Logos, reverse interlinears, King James Version, the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, the New King James Version, and the New International Version. The Naked Bible, Biblical Theology, stripped bare of denominational confessions and theological systems. Also what he calls Paleobabble, which is your antidote to cyber twaddle and misguided research about the ancient world. So one of the things that's going to be different for a lot of the listeners here today is we're actually going to get into a discussion where he says that Zecharia Sitchins are false. There's no merit to it. He discusses how Nibiru is actually a yearly planet cycle, and it has nothing to do with a giant planetary body that's coming to Earth. So for all of you out there that continue to say Nibiru isn't real, this is the show for you. And for those that think Nibiru is real, this is a good show for you also. We'll get into some pretty heated debate, I'm sure. So be civil, folks, on both sides, please. Michael is a bounty of knowledge. He claims to have studied this stuff to the point to where he's one of the best in the world breaking down some of these ancient languages and some of these old mythos that have been around for thousands of years, and some of them that have just been around for maybe 30 or 40, 50 years. Very interesting indeed. So one of the things also that I want to bring up with you guys before we start the show is the divine council that Michael speaks of. This is very fascinating to a lot of people, including myself, and this is another expertise subject for Dr. Heiser. So kick back, enjoy the ride. Thanks, you guys. Dr. Heiser, I really appreciate you joining us tonight here at the Leak Project. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Give us a brief introduction about yourself and why you decided to get into this.
Oh, well, let's hope the audience stays awake for this.
Well, I guess we can make it quick.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have any particular religious background growing up. I mean, I got exposed to, I guess, what we would call, Christian stuff, Christianity, Bible stuff as a teenager through a friend. And, eventually I decided to become a Christian, but I had always, prior to that, been interested in anything kind of old and strange. And I mean, I used to love the Leonard Nimoy In Search of shows and, all that sort of stuff. And I liked languages, even in high school. And so, when I discovered the Bible as a teenager, I thought, boy, this is sort of, everything kind of rolled into one, because it was, it had an academic appeal to me. It had a mystery about it. It was written in, ancient languages. It touched the ancient Near East. And so I was just sort of drawn in, and really, decide to, make this, my focus in college. And I went to seminary a couple of years and actually dropped out of seminary I knew I wasn't cut out for that. I wanted to be an academic, so I wound up going to grad school, and my focus became Old Testament and the Semitic world, ancient Near East, and that's sort of the short version. I mean, I was just drawn into it because I thought that not only was there the strangest stuff there, but there were also the most problems as far as just thorny things in terms of interpretation and I mean now I can articulate it a little better. I think the Old Testament tends to be fundamentally misunderstood, and part of that's because we're so dependent on tradition. Our traditions filter the Bible to us. I like to say that the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. We are outsiders. We're two millennia or more removed from this thing, and we try to impose our own contexts on it, which is a big mistake. We make it then therefore say things that the original writer never had in mind at all, and then we call it interpretation. It just doesn't work that way. But I've just been fascinated by ancient languages and religious stuff, theology, history, ancient culture, any of that, and again anything sort of old and weird. So that's sort of what kept me into the yeah, loosely, the sort of the ancient astronaut stuff. I actually got drawn into that during what should have been the first year of my dissertation. I decided to write a novel that eventually, once it was out, it got me on Coast to Coast AM, and then I started hearing about all this ancient astronaut stuff, really from people who took it seriously, and I became, kind of the hopefully, trying to be mostly friendly debunking guy when it comes to that. It, I don't know how any other way to say it, and I'm not trying to be harsh here, but there are a lot of pretenders in the ancient alien circuit who talk about cuneiform texts and ancient languages and stuff like that, and they don't know any of it. They never took it. They never studied it. They wouldn't know the first thing about it. They couldn't give you the alphabet for any of it, but yet they're the experts. Well, I like to say I am what these people pretend to be. Okay, this is my area, and I'm interested in it. And if the primary texts describe these things, then that's just really cool. But if they don't, if it's fabricated, well, we shouldn't be doing that to people. And so I say that. You shouldn't be lying to people. You shouldn't be making stuff up. It not only deceives people, but it dishonors the ancient people that produced this material. And they wrote not to be misunderstood, not to be a tool of manipulation, but because they had certain things they wanted to communicate. And I get in trouble for that, but oh well, that's just kind of where I'm at.
So if you were to take the Bible and the 66 books that are in it currently today,
Mm-hmm.
and how old is the oldest book in the Bible?
Well, are you asking in terms of the manuscript data we have? Are you asking in terms of Hebrew literacy, the archaeological stuff, or are you asking for
Let's go back to Genesis and
okay.
Adam and Eve, as far back as we were to go. I mean, do you take the Bible as literal? And as far as the time frames and everything else, I mean, is that all basically something that you take as a metaphorically or both?
Well, that's a different question than the dating question, but let's just start there.
Okay.
If you're talking Genesis, I mean the typical traditional view. When I say typical traditional, I mean people who would have a high view of Scripture, believe that it's the Word of God, and so on and so forth. They traditionally believe that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, of course, is the first, was written by Moses. And if there's controversy over how to even chronologically date Moses, but the early date for Moses' life would be roughly 1525 BC. That would be the birth. 120 years later, again, if you take the numbers for his lifespan literally, you just do the math. Then you know when he died. So let's just call it 1500, 1400 BC, something like that. That's the early date. The later one would be a couple hundred years removed. So if you think Moses wrote the Torah, then you're talking, hey, the oldest books in the Bible would be, 1400 BC. something like that. That's when they were composed. Now, what the content of the books, obviously, is a lot older than that. Because if you're talking again Adam and Eve, lots of people would try to take the numbers in Genesis and string all the genealogies together, and that's where you get this Bishop Ussher 4004 BC date, for the creation event and all that sort of stuff. I think that's just hyper literalism. It's over literalism. There are gaps in the genealogies for one thing, and I don't think that the content of Genesis was really intended to give us this kind of scientifically precise information, and I can say that because it's kind of obvious, because they don't know things like, hey, they're germs in the body are carried through the blood. Biblical Hebrew doesn't have a word for brain. The seat of the emotions are your intestines. There's lots of unscientific things in the Bible, and I don't criticize it for that. I think it's kind of stupid when atheists come along and say, well, I can't believe, that the Bible gives us any kind of truth because look at the scientific stuff. It's like, so in other words, you're criticizing the Bible for not being what it was never intended to be. Is that correct? Are you mad at your daughter for not being your son? Are you mad at your dog for not being a cat? It doesn't make any sense to criticize something for not being what you think it ought to be, and then criticize it, beat it up for not being what you want it to be. It was never intended to be that. So, I take kind of a different view, from different sides of this. I don't think that Moses, wrote all of the Torah. There's evidence within the book. There are things that he, couldn't have written, and most likely didn't, because of the way that let's just take Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 1 through 11 has very clear, in some cases word for word, in some cases direct alignment with grammatical forms and structures with Babylonian material. And so to do that, you would have to be writing with access to that material. You'd have to be writing during the age of the Babylonian Empire. You'd have to be in a Babylonian context. Well, Moses was in an Egyptian context, and the stuff that he's hooking into, or at least I should say the stuff that Genesis 1 through 11 is sort of bouncing off of, post dates in some cases the traditional date for Moses' life. And there's no, if you read the biblical story and take it at face value, there's no reason to think that Moses would have had access to this material. But again, that's only the first 11 chapters. I don't doubt that there was a Moses. I don't doubt that he could have written lots of material in the Torah, but I just don't think he wrote all of it. I don't think that's a necessary conclusion. So, I get to, I guess, offend everybody. I don't, again, I'm known for this ancient alien debunking stuff because I think it's basically nonsense. I think it rapes and pillages primary texts. But on the other side, I think some of the traditional approaches to the Bible, and I do consider it the Word of God. But I just don't I don't talk about it the way, again, traditionalists typically talk about it, because they, there's kind of a bibliolatry to it. Like we worship the Bible instead of the God that the Bible is about. And I think that's a mistake. And we sort of say things about the Bible, people do, thinking they're defending it from something. And they wind up saying things that are just demonstrably not true. And that ends up undermining people's faith when they get caught doing that, or when they run into something that just doesn't jive with this, what they've been taught to believe about the Bible, or how they've been taught to think about it. And to me, that's dangerous. That's harmful. We shouldn't be saying things about the Bible that will end up undermining people's faith. I just think that's wrong to do.
Right. And also, there's, you brought up a point a moment ago, a lot of people make their own definition of what the Bible should be. What is the Bible, essentially supposed to be?
The Bible is, the Old Testament. Let's just start there. The Old Testament is the not only the chronicle of the history of Israel, which basically begins, strictly speaking, in Genesis 12 thereon, through the rest of the whole Bible. But even the story of Adam has very clear analogous points to the story of Israel. A lot of people think that the whole story of Adam, while they would affirm creationism, actually was written to be sort of a what's called a type or a typology, a precursor, a prefigurement of the history of the nation. Adam and Israel have these clear analogous things about the way their lives are described, their histories are described. But it's basically the chronicle of this people, and in a larger sense, it does include the idea. Again, I think the idea of the creation stories and the fall and the flood and things like that. That there is a God, that God is interested in humanity. He created humanity. He loves humanity, and He has a destiny in mind for them. There's all sorts of really, I think, significant ideas that come out of Genesis, the creation stories that tell us how God thinks about humanity and what He wants the human destiny to be, the story, and how He wants to be part of that, wants to live and relate to His intelligent created beings. That's what God wants. But we have human rebellion, we have divine rebellion in this story. And a lot of the Bible is really about how to repair that relationship, how humanity can be redeemed from its condition, fallen condition. It's corruption, again, just the way things are. And so it's both global, it's universal, but it's also, again, very focused on this people Israel. Then when you get in the New Testament, the New Testament church, of course, grows out of Israel, and the central focus is Jesus, who is in the biblical story, God become man for very specific reasons. I don't know that we want to do, theology on this show, but I'm certainly, keen to do that if you want to. But there are very specific reasons why the incarnation was a necessity in the biblical story, and the event of the cross was a necessity. But it's still very, Israel-focused, people of God-focused, but now it includes the nations and the Gentiles and all that. So it's really about human status, human destiny, God's desire to have a human family along with His divine family, and again have those two families blend together. Eden again cast as the place where heaven met earth. God wants to be with His creatures, to enjoy them and have them enjoy Him, but it all sort of goes to hell in a handbasket real fast. And then the story becomes how that God doesn't give up. There is no plan B, and so how do we bring this back full circle to make humanity all that God wants it to be, and to be united, be reunited as a family, God with His creatures.
Now, do you take the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden literally? I mean, or is there some mythology to that?
Well, I think there's a little bit of both working on there. I don't like the term mythology. I don't mind the term mythic, and a lot of people don't understand the difference. Myth, again, in an academic sense, simply means that here's a story and it has divine beings as part of the story. Divine beings are characters. They do things that transcend human ability. And the Bible is certainly that. I'm not a philosophical materialist. I think philosophical materialism or naturalistic materialism is incoherent. I think we've had a couple of millennia of philosophy basically beat that horse to death. So I do think that there is a spiritual reality. There are spiritual beings. There's a reality that transcends the physical world that we experience with our five senses. And if that world, again, wants to intersect with ours and invade it, I don't think that I can say, well, that can't happen. So I'm very cautious, when it comes to criticizing some of those ideas. Now, for that reason, I do believe there's a creator. If the creator wants to create a single human pair, and that's where we get humanity, great. I think a lot of the genetics work. I actually follow this. I'm kind of interested in the historical Adam thing. Even geneticists, will entertain the thought of a single human pair. Again, that's the scientific way of talking about Adam and Eve. The Bible gives them names. Adam just means humankind. Eve is the mother of all living. So you need a male and a female. It's not that complicated. And they could have certainly been real people, but I'm open to the notion that the biblical story is sort of told in mythic abstract, and the point is that there was a single pair, and God is responsible for that pair, and they had to go through the whatever process of evolution to get humans as we know them. That doesn't bother me, because again, the Bible isn't designed to try to do science. Think about this theologically. And again, if you have traditional Christians in your audience, I'm very conservative in my theology, but I might not sound like it. But you got to think about what the Bible's actually telling you. Here's what it's telling you. It's telling you that there was a God who decided in the second millennium BC to prompt somebody to write something down. Now, by definition, that person or persons, they aren't scientists. They don't know about genetics. They don't know about physics. They don't know the basics of the scientific stuff that we know. There's nothing in the Bible that says God changed their intellect to bring them up to speed so that they could write a creation account that conforms to 21st century scientific information. There's nothing like that in the pages of the Bible at all. So what we're asked to believe is that God prompted people in the second millennium BC to write something down from their worldview, their frame of reference, their cognitive frame of reference, as scholars like to call it. And God chose them because there were certain things, certain ideas, certain precepts about himself that God wanted people to know. He wanted them to know that I'm responsible for you being here. I'm your creator. I created everything. I created you. I'm interested in your destiny. Okay, I created human beings not because I had to or there was some lack in me. I just wanted to do it, and I enjoy them. And I don't want them to rebel against me. And when they did, I'm not going to kill you off. I'm going to, work with you and redeem you and all this stuff. These big picture ideas. Okay, this is what the Bible does. It doesn't do theoretical physics. It doesn't do modern cosmology. It doesn't do genetics. But we somehow seem to think that we have to press it into these molds. And in so doing, we make it what it wasn't and what it wasn't even intended to be. And these are God's decisions. God decided, when to do this. If God came today, if we didn't have a Bible and God came today and he prompted Stephen Hawking to write, the creation story, well, Hawking would do it a lot differently, wouldn't he? But guess what? 1,000 years from now, people would pick that up and laugh and snicker and say, can you believe they used to think this? Because 1,000 years from now, science will change. But if the goal, if the enterprise, that God had in mind was just tell people that they didn't create themselves, that there's a creator, they're responsible to me, I love them, that when they sin, I want to redeem them, but there are ways that I want them, to approach me. Just again, big picture thoughts that transcends science. It's not hooked into science at all. It's a message that never changes. Again, that transcends all this stuff that will change. In other words, the scientific knowledge that we have. This is actually what the Bible is. It's an ancient document. It's Mediterranean-centered. These are God's decisions. So why don't we just honor that? Why do we have to reinvent it to be this thing that answers our modern questions? Why do we have to make it into this thing that it was never intended to be? Like I said, I say that, and people from all sides of the aisle get mad at me for saying that. But to be honest with you, that is one of the most obvious things in the world. That is just not hard to grasp. Just taking what it is at face value and not minimizing God's role at all. In fact, maximizing it. God preparing people through their whole lives for the moments that he would want them to write something. And they did the job. God looks at it and says, yeah, that's a good job. That'll do. That'll tell people what I want them to know. We don't have to worry about whether it conforms to 21st century science or not, because that ain't the point. If I wanted to do that, I'd wait till the 21st century rolled around and get somebody then to do it.
Okay. And another thing, too, there was a listener that sent me an email earlier, one of our members here at the Leak Project, or one of our subscribers, and they knew I was going to have an opportunity to speak with you. They know your work very well. And the point that you just brought up about how the Bible kind of going past 1,000 years and people not looking at it like, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous, kind of like science does rewrite itself every 10 years. It seems like every 6 months now. I mean, it's just incredible. There's so many things in the Bible that I'm just wondering, should they really be there? So, for example, here's just a couple of quotes that are taken out of the Old Testament, and they're pretty powerful. Like one, this is from Exodus 21:15. Whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Here's another one, Proverbs 20:20. If one curses his father or mother, his lamp will go out at the coming of darkness. Death for adultery. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the man and the woman shall be put to death. Leviticus 20:10. Is that kind of stuff also, I mean, is that literal as well? Should that happen for people that do that? I mean, because if you looked at if kids did that now, I don't think there'd be any of them.
Well, there are some deep flaws in the assumption behind the question, but I'll just pick a few of them. For the first part, these are laws, of course, associated with the theocracy, the Mosaic law. Let's just stick to the Torah stuff here. That makes the discussion easier. And there is the theocracy, by definition, if you actually read the entirety of the Bible. In other words, the entirety of the Bible actually has a context and an overarching narrative. The theocracy was designed to become obsolete from the beginning. In other words, this theocratic arrangement that was operative during the days of Moses was designed to just disappear. How do we know that? Because the covenants that preceded it included the Gentiles, the Abrahamic covenant. What that means is that what we read in the Torah was never intended to be binding revelation on people for all time. It was designed to go away, and you actually see it going away in the pages of the Gospels. They don't have a theocracy then, and God can look at that and say, well, yeah, no kidding, because the idea that I had for humankind to begin with transcended the theocracy anyway. That was a way station. That was a placeholder. So the question that should we do this for today is, on one hand, understandable because people read this stuff out of the Bible, and the Bible's this book for all of us, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, it's absurd because it was never planned to last anyway. Again, if you actually read the entirety of Scripture and set things in that context. The other thing I would say is that there are a lot of these laws, again, and people who do comparative ancient Near Eastern work, can tell you this until your mind is numbed. But these laws, like with adultery and whatnot, and the assaulting of the parents, they have ancient Near Eastern parallels, from many different cultures. And what that tells us is that God didn't invent this culture. God comes to Israel. Israel is, at the beginning, a nomadic, nomadic culture. They eventually settle. They go through a period of bondage in Egypt and a lot of stuff, but they eventually become urban, in the land of Canaan and whatnot. But the culture that they have and the laws of the culture that they have were already around when God decided to call people like Abraham and have Moses deliver the people from Egypt and so on and so forth. In other words, these laws weren't invented by God. They were invented by people. And when God wanted to work with people, he didn't say, well, I'd work with you if you changed all your culture. I'd work with you if you just looked at this a different way. Okay, he doesn't say that at all. But yet, again, behind the question is this assumption that, again, God somehow invented all these things out of whole cloth and then wants to impose them on everyone. Again, I understand why the question's asked, but the premise is absurd. So, let's just talk about the laws and why the culture, would sort of look at things the way it does. The death penalty offenses in Scripture there aren't, there are more than we like to look at, But there's only one that preceded the theocracy, by the way, and that was the death penalty for murder. Because back in Genesis 9, whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Because in the image of God made he man. Murder was so offensive because it was like killing God in effigy. Humanity was God's image, God's imager. If you assaulted a human being and killed him, it was as though you were attacking God. And that plays up into the culture, again, because you're still dealing with a monotheistic culture here, even before you get scripture written. That if you do bodily harm to someone else, kidnapping is a death penalty offense. Assault, is a death penalty offense. Like you just read, murder and stuff like that. These are death penalty offenses because humans were made in God's image, and that's why it was deemed so offensive. It was like blasphemy to do certain things to another human being, and so they just carried it sort of to the nth degree. That in that mode of thinking. Adultery, again, is tied into not just, our sense of romance and lust or whatever it is, but it's actually tied into the abandonment of a woman. Okay, I cheat on my wife. I do this deliberately. I want someone else's wife. So now I'm interfering with the progeny of this other family, and chances are, that the woman, who's the victim here, their husband's either going to leave them or I'm going to leave my wife. And in that culture, a woman without a man was destitute. They were literally destitute. They would either have to resort to prostitution or slavery. And again, it was deemed so offensive that this was thought to be the best deterrent. And we don't need to do this sort of thing today because our culture is quite different, both in terms of its attitude and the way we would protect victims in such a situation. But we're dealing with antiquity. The circumstances aren't the same. This is the way the culture was. And again, when God comes to people and asks them to write, scripture, he doesn't say, well, don't put that in there because, I don't want that, or change your culture and then I'll be happy to deal with you or use you to do something I want done. That just isn't the way it happened.
So, and another thing too is that also if you do look through the Bible, it does seem as if once you get to the New Testament, it's a whole new ball game. And that's one thing that I've often wondered is why is there such a big change when, if you read some of the stuff in the Old Testament, there's points there where there's talks about 50,000 men, women, and children being killed because of their lineage. And then it just seems to kind of mellow out after that, 1,000 years later or whatever. So what do you think the biggest change was? Do you think it was man that decided, or, God was like, okay, it's time to chill out. Let's relax. This is a little too intense.
Yeah, well, there are a number of things in play here. I mean, one is the planned obsolescence of the theocracy. That is a factor. Another one, like with the wars of conquest and the so-called genocide. People like to use these terms because they're inflammatory. Like what goes on in the wars of conquest is just this indiscriminate genocidal killing. Well, I would invite people to get my book, Unseen Realm, and in chapters 23 and 25, you're going to get a different perspective. Now, what you're going to read, if you actually, again, frame the conquest accounts in the supernatural worldview terms of the Israelite, if you actually go through the account, what the Israelites are told to do, there are a number of verbs for it. There are verbs of killing, for sure. There's karem, which is to devote to destruction, shamad, destroy, all that kind of stuff. But there are also verbs like drive out, dispossess, expel, that don't involve killing. Well, it's kind of interesting. If you look up the conquest accounts where the verbs of killing occur, they overlap with places where the Anakim were seen when the Israelites spied out the land. Who are the Anakim? They are descendants of the Nephilim. They are very specific bloodlines. They're very specific giant clans. And in the Israelite religious worldview, these were people groups, again, that were unusual because they were unusually tall, but they were believed to be spawned either directly or, again, with some, kind of divine intervention. They were deliberately believed to be raised up by hostile gods to exterminate Israel. So when it came to those bloodlines, it was an us or them mentality. That was the way they looked at it. They didn't look at everybody that way, but the Anakim were, sprinkled throughout the land. They lived among other people. So yeah, there's going to be lots of casualties that didn't have to be casualties, but it's not this indiscriminate bloodlust, that people want to cast it as. That is a misreading of the text. And I know some of your listeners might not like me saying that, but that's just too bad because that's what it is. You have to read the text closely because the conquest begins and ends with the Anakim. It begins in Numbers 13. Moses and Joshua get to the border of the land after they leave Sinai. They trek over to the land. They send in 12 spies. 10 of them come back and say, hey, they all come back and say, hey, the land is everything God said it was. It's awesome. But 10 of them say, we might as well just turn around and leave right now because we saw the Anakim in the land. And we're like grasshoppers next to them. The Anakim are from the Nephilim, the giants. There's just no way we can do this. And 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, say, what's the problem? Weren't you there at the Red Sea? I mean, come on, we can do this. But God says, fine, you don't want to believe. I'm going to send you, let you wander for 40 years. So that's the conquest initially fails. And then when 40 years later, when they go back in under Joshua and they have these wars, how does Joshua define the conclusion of the conquest in Joshua 11? There are no more Anakim in the land. Okay, it begins and ends with the giant clans. Joshua adds, well, the ones that are left, there are actually some left. They went to the Philistine cities of Gath, and Ashdod and Ashkelon. Well, guess where we find the rest of the giant clans later in Israel's history? The Philistines, the Philistine countries. It's Goliath. He's from Gath. Okay, and so Goliath and his brothers are the last vestiges of these bloodlines, and that's why those stories are in the Bible, because they have to be killed off. It's very focused, again, on particular groups. It's not just, hey, let's go in there and kill everybody we can. But again, that's how people want to portray it, because they have an axe to grind, again, against the Bible for whatever reason. And some people have good reasons. Some people have bad reasons, in my experience. But it just, there are these caricatures about the Bible, both in terms of church people have certain caricatures about it, and people who hate the church, again, for either good or bad reasons, sensible or nonsensible reasons. But they have their own caricatures too. And we just have to come to grips with the fact that we're not reading the text closely, and these are caricatures. So if we want to be honest, if we want to really be honest, maybe we ought to read the thing, okay, and read it a few times and read it closely so we can speak more intelligently about this thing we call the Bible.
And there's been so many translations as well. A lot of books like, for example, the Book of Enoch that some people feel should be in the Bible. Some say no, and obviously it's not in the canon that's out there today, and none of them that I know of. Why is there that disconnect with so many of these books? And do you feel that some books should actually be there? For example, the Book of Enoch?
Well, I mean, Enoch is considered canonical in the Ethiopian church. I mean, it has been for some time. And it's largely because they kind of have a history with it. I hate to put it this way, but and it's a question I like. I really like Enoch. So it's a question I get a lot, and I do a lot of work in it. But I really don't consider the question important. I don't know how else to put it, and here's why. I'll try to explain that. People get fixated on this canon question. Should it be in the canon or not? Well, what that tells me is that it sounds like you don't think it's important unless it is in the canon. Why would you think that?
Oh, a lot of people do think that. Most people, I would say, do in religion.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And so I like to get people, thinking along that line, because then I'll ask them, look, tell me why a book has to be canonical to be important. Again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, it's very clear that Jude and Peter, who did write books in the New Testament, knew Enoch very well and took it seriously because they have material from Enoch in their own epistles. Okay, that, for instance, 2 Peter 2, the whole thing about the spirits in prison kept in chains of gloomy darkness until the end. The spirits who were sent to Tartarus. There's actually a verb tartarao there. Okay, that is drawn from the Greek version of the Titan story, which is, again, one of the Titan stories anyway, is the same as Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim. Okay, that's not in the Old Testament. That's not in Genesis 6. That comes from Enoch. So that tells us that Peter, and Jude has that kind of stuff in there too, that they had read this book and they considered it useful, helpful for them to articulate some point in their own epistle that is in the New Testament. So if Peter and Jude thought it was important, why does it matter if it's canon? I mean, the Old Testament writers quote from all sorts of stuff. Paul quotes from Greek poets half a dozen times. I think it would be a better question to ask, why aren't we reading stuff that the biblical writers read? Because if we read that stuff and we understood it and had it in our heads, maybe when we were reading the Bible, we'd actually understand what these guys are writing a little bit better, because we can think their thoughts more capably after them. Now, when you get to the canon question, I do think it's interesting, but again, on one level, I don't really care, because I'm going to read all the stuff anyway. If Peter and Jude read it, then I ought to read it, because then it'll help me read them better. I don't really care if it's in the canon. Who gives a rip? If I get to heaven someday and God says, "Hey, Mike, you did a good job, but you missed that Enoch thing. That really belonged in there." I'm not going to say, "Oh, well, crud, I don't want to be here anymore." It's just absurd. I don't really care.
Right.
Why would I?
Right.
Why would I react that way? I don't really care. But the question is kind of interesting. Let's just take the Catholic Bible and versus the Protestant. I mean, there are historical reasons why they're different. The the early church inherited, the early church was largely composed of Gentiles. I mean, it comes out of Jewish roots, but, because of the Apostle Paul and evangelism generally, you have lots of people who aren't Jews that embrace Jesus as Messiah and accept Christ as their Savior. And so they can't read, books in Hebrew, and even for the Jews, the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew was eventually lost largely as a literary language, and they had to put things in Aramaic. But the Gentiles can't read any of this stuff, so they can read Greek. And so in the first couple centuries before Jesus, the Old Testament was translated into Greek. That's called the Septuagint. And that's the Bible that most of the time in the New Testament, the apostles and Jesus quote from. And we can tell that because you just go look up what the verse says in the Septuagint, and is it a match or not? Okay, it's easy to do. So we have this thing called the Septuagint, and that becomes, again, the Bible of the first Christians. They only have the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and then as New Testament material gets written in Greek, that gets added to this body of literature. Well, when somebody comes along and says, "Hey, this scroll thing that we're doing is kind of cumbersome. Why don't we cut the scroll into pieces and stack them, and then kind of paste aside and then flip it open?" Somebody has to invent the book. Okay, and somebody did that. And when they did that, guess what? They threw all sorts of stuff in it. It wasn't just the Septuagint. It wasn't just the books of the New Testament. There were other books they put in the collection. And some of these have survived. And so when the church transitions into something more official, and it becomes what we know as the Catholic Church during the latter part of the Roman Empire, this is the Bible that it inherits. It just inherits it historically. And so the Catholic Church has an Old Testament that has books in it that weren't recognized by the Jews because they were using books that were written in Greek. So it's sort of an accident of history. When you have the Protestants come along, like with Martin Luther, again, I'm not a Lutheran and I'm not dissing Lutherans here, but sometimes I get the impression Luther's sitting there thinking, what are some of the things that we can do to not be Catholic? And one of them was, well, let's change the Old Testament canon. So he takes a look at the books that the Catholic Church assigned to their Old Testament and says, you know what, for us, we're going to only accept the books that the Jewish community, the rabbinic community, accept. And so they lopped off books that historically had grown up through, the early church because of things like codexes and books in the Septuagint. That's why the Catholics have First and Second Maccabees in their Bible and Tobit. These books that the Protestants call apocryphal. Again, it's just an accident of history. Should they be in there? Shouldn't they be in there? Is the Protestant canon right? Is the Catholic canon right? Is the Ethiopian canon right? That's got Enoch in there too? My answer to that is, who cares? Just read the stuff. If you want a minimalist canon, go with the Protestants. It's fine. If you want, to assign, sacred status to the other books that the Catholic Church does, fine. A lot, Christians did that for centuries. It's not going to kill you. You're not going to get a disease. All right. It doesn't really matter. You read the Bible again. Let's just call it the minimalist one, but read the other stuff too, because it all informed Christian writing and Christian discourse and Christian debate. During the early centuries of the church, all of these things were considered important enough to read, even if people disagreed on should we assign a specific status to it. It was all stuff that was important.
Well, I really like what you just said about how read other things too, and don't just base everything on this specific canon of 66 books that have been compiled. And as perfect as people want to believe it is.
Well, I wouldn't put the Arancha book in there. But
well,
yeah.
That's a whole other story. I meant the 66 books in the typical Holy Bible, like the King James Version. That's a whole other story.
Well, by the way, the original King James Version has the apocryphal books in it. That was one of the concessions, because their Protestantism was different than Luther's and different than Calvin's. But you can, if you actually go to a museum or someplace, we actually have one of these where I work. We have a 1611 Bible, and to kind of needle people, we often just leave it open to one of the apocryphal books, just so that people know that, hey, that was in there, in 1611. Yeah, it was. They printed those up too.
Right. And another thing too is with Revelations, there's so much information with what could the possibilities be. And I've read that book more than any of them in there.
Well, that's being generous.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And it's a fascinating, indeed, absolutely incredible. And then you can look at some of the things that are happening today and say, yeah, there's correlations there. But I just want to bring something up, because if you say, oh, well, rumors of war, continual war, it's always been like that.
Yeah, it's always been like that.
I mean, you can, and if you look at today versus the medieval times, when people might have been blamed for being a witch, whether they were or not, some of the stuff that they had to go through, the torture chambers and stuff, make waterboarding look pretty good. I mean, it was pretty bad stuff, or whatever. Maybe you went on maybe you stole a piece of bread, or you didn't give the king his ransom, and they said, okay, well, we're going to make you go through this torture chamber. So, I mean, certainly things in some ways you could say, yeah, it's a lot better now than it was then, a lot more freedoms and stuff. But do you think that we could be possibly towards the end times? What's your take on Revelations and where we are today?
Yeah, I tend to be kind of a stick in the mud because, drum roll, please. I'm going to be honest. I don't know. I have no idea, and frankly, nobody else does either. I taught, undergrad in a religious, well, not just a religious school. I taught at a Catholic school. I taught at a Christian school, Protestant Christian school. Taught at a university, and I've taught lots of classes and a number of them on theology. And I know all the systems about end times, and they all cheat. Okay, I don't like any of the systems that theologians you could get in your theology books about the end times, because that is the honest truth. They all look beautiful and coherent because they sort of push all the problem passages to the side. They don't deal with the outliers. They look beautiful until you compare them to another one, and then you get to see sort of the sore spots. So I don't take any particular view of end times other than this. I believe that prophecy, biblical prophecy, the first time around, the first coming of Christ, was deliberately cryptic. In other words, you weren't supposed to know what it meant until you were after the fact. And I take that from something Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, where he's talking about the crucifixion, what happened to Jesus, and he says, had the rulers of this world known, again, what the result of the crucifixion would have, was, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. Now, rulers of this world is a phrase taken from the Old Testament, specifically the Septuagint by Paul, for not for human beings, but for the powers of darkness, specifically the ruling princes, the angelic princes over the nations. So what Paul is saying is, look, had the powers of darkness known that the crucifixion was actually the thing that needed to happen for the plan of salvation to be triggered and enacted, and also their own demise to be triggered and enacted, they would never have done it because they aren't morons, okay? Satan and demons, and again, whatever other labels you want to put to the powers of darkness, they didn't know what the plan was. Now, they knew who Jesus was. You see that's evident in the Gospels. You see that all over the place. They call him the Son of the Most High. Actually, they're the only ones that do that. The other people, even Jesus' followers, don't call him that. But the demons somehow know who he is. And again, I can imagine the reasoning in their heads goes something like this. Okay, here's the Son of the Most High, and God's Son. Here he is, and there's only one reason God would have sent this guy here. Here he is trying to restore Eden again, trying to do that kingdom of God thing and save humanity thing, and come back to Earth and all that stuff. Well, we like it here. This is our turf. So let's get rid of this guy. Not knowing that is exactly what needed to be done. That was the whole purpose of it. And so they essentially hang themselves. And Paul says if they had known this, they never would have done it. I go into churches sometimes. You might get a chuckle out of this. But I've gone into churches sometimes and talked about this, and I'll say something like, folks, do you realize that there isn't a single verse in the Old Testament that describes a Messiah who would be God incarnate, who would die and rise again for the sins of the world? And people look at you horrified. Like, what? What about Isaiah 53, the suffering servant? I said, well, guess what? The word Mashiach, Messiah, never occurs in that passage. And they're dumbfounded. And I say, look, think about what happens. Even after the resurrection, there's Jesus in the upper room with the disciples. He's standing in front of them. The risen Christ is standing in front of them, and they still don't get it. The account in Luke says that Jesus had to open their minds so that they could understand. And the reason they don't get it is not because they're idiots. Jesus didn't call the 12 dumbest guys he could find. The reason they don't get it is because they weren't supposed to get it. Because the messianic profile is not in a verse or two in completeness. It's scattered in 100 places. It's disassembled. It's like a mosaic. It's exploded in little bits in the Old Testament. You can't understand it unless you are living after the fact. And so my view of prophecy is, hey fellas, hey folks, if it worked that way the first time, that's the way it's going to be the second time. So if it's entertaining to you to, try to figure out, are we in the end times? And, is Barack Obama the Antichrist? We used to think it was Gorbachev, and we used to think it was Kissinger, and we used to think it was Hitler. And, have fun with that. I mean, I guess that's worth some time, might be entertaining, but ultimately it's a waste of time. An obsession with end times, I think, is a waste of time. There are far better things that you can study in Scripture. Live out your faith among people. Serve people. Tell people about Jesus or something. But to sort of squirrel your life away, trying to figure out what's going to happen in the end times and are we living in them, it's just a waste of time. It's not the way it was intended the first time, and it's not going to be the way it works out the second time. So, so I'm a real popular guy on the prophecy circuit. You know, yeah, I mean, no, honestly, I don't get invited to these things, and this is why. I said, look, I'm, I would never do this again. So just, this is just me, Mike talking. Maybe it's a little too late at night for Mike. I don't know, but I could walk into one of these prophecy conferences and say, look, fellas, I'm the only one here with actual credentials to do this. And I could pretend to be superior. And I could write books and come up with an amazing, detailed, layered, scholarly presentation of, what when I think Jesus is coming back, and I can write that book and rake in the money, but I'm not going to do it. Okay. And my point is, that's what some of you guys are doing. You're writing this stuff because it allows you to make a living, off people's hopes and at worst, their gullibility. And you start setting dates and doing crazy stuff like Bible codes. I mean, you ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Um, that's just the way I look at it. The honest truth is we don't know. So just be honest with people. Just tell them you don't know. Don't invent stuff just to have people pay you to invent it. And by the way, this is how I look at all the ancient astronaut stuff too. It just, I don't like when people get lied to. It's a button on me that just is easily pushed. And you get these people running around with this ancient alien garbage. And that's what it is. When people start appealing to ancient texts, again, I'm sort of infamous for saying, look, I am what this other guy is pretending to be. I actually have graduate degrees in these ancient languages. I know if these texts say what they say they say. And in many cases, what they say is in these texts literally does not exist. It's not a question of translating, Mike's translation disagrees with mine. No, you can't translate what doesn't exist. You're making it up. And you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that to people. It's not right to do that.
You had an opportunity to translate the Sumerian texts?
Anything I've done in Sumerian has, been in my own time. I mean, I didn't take a course in Sumerian. I took a course in 10 or 12 other ones, but you can't take a course in everything. I mean, I studied it, on my own. I have 2 or 3 grammars and reference grammars and whatnot. But I actually spend more time in other languages. But I there's some you got to take for grad school. There's only so many credits you can afford, and the other stuff, if you're interested in it, you got 9 or 10 of these under your belt. You add another one, it's not so bad. You do it because it's you assign value to it, or you find it interesting, and so that's kind of my relationship to Sumerian.
And you've translated the Bible multiple in different languages, correct?
Yeah, I've done a lot of translation for that, either again in the course of graduate school or my job. You know, I'm probably the only person in the world who has compared every word of the King James, the English translation, to the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek word or segment of a word from which it derives. And I didn't do that because I wanted to prove anything. That was my job for a year. Where I work, we create digital tools, and we created something called a reverse interlinear. And I got to do the King James, and that's what it was. It was handwork. It took me a whole year to create this digital tool, but you had to look at every word and align it with every segment of the original language. So it's not translation, but it's kind of like translation. But I've done some pure translation too. But in the job I have, it involves a lot of that kind of work. So yeah, I'm used to sticking my head in ancient texts and those kinds of projects.
Have you read the Nag Hammadi treatise or the text in there?
Yeah, I've read a lot of the so-called Gnostic Gospels. it's kind of it's an unfortunate term actually. I think we're actually better to do it the way you just did it, the Nag Hammadi texts or the Nag Hammadi corpus. Because when you hear gospel, people hear that and they think, oh, a gospel, it's like a biography, it's like an itinerary, a story of this person's life, Jesus. And you read some of the Nag Hammadi stuff, it ain't like that at all. It's just like night and day. Like the Gospel of Thomas, it's not a biography. It's not even a story. It's a collection of sayings, is all it is. But yet people labeled it the Gospel of Thomas, but it's nothing like that. So people, I think, tend to be disappointed, when they actually go look it up. So I'm kind of cautious about that because, yeah, it's ancient material. I mean, the early church, the first couple centuries, 200, 300 AD. I mean, they were familiar with this material and had to interact with it. So I think it's worth reading. It post dates biblical material, so it's not like this is the primary reason why the Gnostic material was never considered for inclusion in the New Testament because it was later. It couldn't be tied to someone in the first century who had traveled with Jesus or who had traveled with Paul, and so by definition, it was sort of in a different category. But anyway, I guess we don't need to rabbit trail into that. But
Sure. Now, also, there are some other books that I was fascinated with. One was called The Secret Book of John, and it's a Gnostic text, and it talks about these archons that were basically, it has a real different spin on Genesis, but it has the same players, yet these archons that come into play. Have you had an opportunity to read that?
I think you're probably referring to the Apocryphon of John. That I'd have
That
to know. I'd
could
have
be
to know
another
what you're
name for it.
thinking.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like in the Nag Hammadi, in the major English edition, the one edited by Robinson. It's the Apocryphon of John.
Okay, it talks
Yeah,
about Yaldabaoth being the chief
yeah,
archon and such. Yeah, very interesting.
yeah. This is sort of standard. I mean, Gnostic cosmology isn't monolithic. There are actually different versions of Gnostic cosmology. It's not all consistent. But in the one you're referring to, yeah, the archons are of course created by the demiurge to assist in the enslavement of humanity. And the demiurge for the Gnostics was the god of the Bible. The god of the Bible in Gnostic cosmology is evil. He's the bad guy. They refer to, in fact, the God of the Bible to the Gnostics isn't really even like the true God. The true God is this ethereal, sort of impersonal, light thing, that was out there in the universe somewhere, and parts of him were the aeons. The aeons collectively, the pleroma, are the true God. But one of them, Sophia, goes astray and decides she wants to be like the true God and try her hand at creating things. And she unfortunately creates the demiurge, who turns around and says, well, hey, I want my own planet and I want to populate it with a bunch of slaves. And so that turns out to be the God of the Bible in Gnostic thinking, and he's just not a good guy. And so she has pity. Sophia has pity on the beings that the demiurge is making. And so she decides, well, the only thing I can do here is to put a little spark of my own divinity in them. And my own divinity comes from the true God, the higher up being, whatever that is. And so each person in Gnostic theology has a little spark of divinity, a little spark of the true God in them. And so salvation to a Gnostic is gnosis, is the knowledge, the awakening to this, fact in Gnostic thinking that, I'm basically internally I'm God. And I this is salvation, coming to know this thing about who I really am, and I'm not just a slave of the demiurge. So yeah, the archons again are the henchmen of the demiurge to keep humanity enslaved and in line. Not a good thing. I mean, that story has been used, of course, for the ancient alien thing. Some forms of the ancient alien mythology are basically nothing more than Gnosticism repackaged in 21st century garb. Ancient alien stuff is more complicated than that, but that's one version of it at least is just repackaged Gnosticism.
I talked to somebody that is of Muslim faith a few years ago, and he said that he believes that Muhammad actually left in some type of spacecraft. Is that normal for most?
Is your friend named Louis Farrakhan?
No, no, he's not. No.
Oh yeah,
Is that common in the
Farrakhan.
Muslim religion?
It's not common, but in the is there a better term than Black Muslim? I mean, what don't isn't there a term they use for their own movement? I can't remember what
He's
it is.
very Americanized.
Yeah, yeah. Farrakhan is sort of notorious for this idea that of connecting the extraterrestrial idea with Islam, but it's very idiosyncratic to him. Now, having said that, though, if you read the Quran closely, it does have Adam being created, for lack of a better way to put this, being created off planet. Again, if you read the Quran closely, you'll get that. But that's a far cry from going off in the mothership, and stuff like that. That's Farrakhan's wing of the Black Muslim movement. I mean, even all Black Muslims wouldn't be thinking that, but yeah, Farrakhan's actually said that publicly, like in speeches and whatnot. It's very idiosyncratic. So I would not want to color Islam with that particular trajectory, but you'll find it in that wing of it anyway.
Okay. Now, and you've also said you've studied these languages, you've actually done your homework, spent the time and money to learn this and get this education. And a lot of people say they can do it, but they just reading something off the internet and saying, wow, this is a 12-foot reptilian shapeshifter that eats people and it has laser beams that comes out of its eyeballs. And it can also turn into this gigantic artificial intelligent transformer.
Optimus Prime, yeah.
Yeah, Optimus Prime is awesome, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, hey, I like the movies too,
Right, right. For somebody that has a real down-to-earth approach and has done the research into these specific texts of the Bible, how would you debunk and say this is, without a shadow of a doubt, this is not an extraterrestrial conehead?
Well, there's about 5 or 6 different things, in that question. I mean, I personally am not offended at all by the thought that there could be extraterrestrial life. I don't see any theological problem with it, intelligent extraterrestrial life. So to me, and I'm not, this isn't unusual in the field of ufology, but there are a lot of ufologists out there, and I'm not a ufologist by trade or anything like that. I wound up being named by Fate magazine one of the 100 most influential people in ufology, but I'm not quite sure how that happened. But I can tell you, I know enough that within the field, there are a lot of people who make a pretty hard and fast distinction between the subject of UFOs and the question of intelligent extraterrestrial life, and even the question of extraterrestrial visitation. They distinguish that from the ancient alien stuff. And I'm one of those, because I think the ancient alien stuff is blather, it's nonsense. But I think the issue of could there be intelligent extraterrestrial life, that I think is a serious question. And I think it deserves serious treatment. And frankly, it's one of those things on my list of things I'd love to see before I die. I just think it would be so cool if that were the case. Again, I don't have any theological problem with it at all, but my objection is the cartoonish nonsense that gets passed off as ancient alien stuff. And it look, you don't have to go to grad school and get a PhD to debunk this stuff. It's actually easy. Let me give you a couple of examples. Okay, we've all seen these pictures on the internet of the Anunnaki beings. They have these like little clay figurines that kind of look like they have lizard faces and whatnot. Well, let's just ask a few intelligent questions. One, how do you know it's an Anunnaki being? Is there any writing on the object? Answer, no. These are figures known from a layer in Mesopotamian archaeology called the Ubaid culture. Guess what? It's prehistoric. There is no writing on any of these objects. Let me repeat that. There's no writing on a single one of them. Zero. Okay, second question. Well, were they found with other objects that have writing? Answer, no. Well, how do we know then what it is and what it was for? Answer, we don't. But yet you have ancient alien theorists that erect an entire story of a civilization on these objects. You know what that's called? That's called making stuff up. Okay, there isn't a single textual basis to any of it. Let's talk about, Anunnaki stuff. Well, on my website, okay, I have a number of websites. I have a website called sitchiniswrong.com. Okay, just SITCHIN iswrong.com. And one of the things I do on the website, it's not exciting, but it's effective, at least for people who care about data. I make a screen capture video. I made a screen capture video of me. Just you watch my mouse. I go up to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature online. It's run by the University of Oxford. And I show people, okay, here we are at the search field. Here's how you type in Anunnaki in transliteration. Hit the button, and it will deliver to you all of the cuneiform texts in which the Anunnaki are mentioned. And then when you get those texts, they're in transliteration. So like, what do? I can't read any of this. Well, then you click the TR link next to it, because that means translation. And I challenge people in the video, look, don't take Mike's word for it. Go up, do the search, hit the TR button, and read all of the text. It's a little over 100 of them. And what you will find is that there isn't a single text, a single Sumerian text that has the Anunnaki associated with Nibiru in any way. You will not find a single text that has the Anunnaki coming from any planet other than Nibiru. You won't find a text that has the Anunnaki traveling here in a spaceship. You won't find any of the core ideas that are in Zecharia Sitchin's writings, but do not take Mike's word for it. Have the courage, frankly, the honesty to go up to the site, do the search, just like I'm showing you to do it, hit the button, and read it for yourself. Okay, I have on the same website things about Nibiru. There are lots of astronomical cuneiform texts. The Mesopotamians were into astronomy. But there is no Mesopotamian astronomical text at all in existence that names a planet beyond Saturn. Why? Because they're doing naked eye astronomy. Nibiru is mentioned a few times in texts. It is identified, now catch this, with the planet Mercury. It's also identified with the planet Jupiter, which ought to ring a bell like, well, how can it be one of the... It can't be both of them. That's correct. It's also called a star. What Nibiru is really like an astronomical event, like a conjunction kind of thing. There is no cuneiform text, no Sumerian text that has Nibiru going through our solar system every 3,600 years. Nibiru, in fact, is in an astrolabe occurring annually. These are what's the point, Mike? The point is that a lot of this ancient astronaut stuff, when it comes to this kind of textual material, is just bunk. And it's not bunk because Mike doesn't like it or Mike is opposed religiously to extraterrestrials. I'm not. Okay, I'm not. I think it would be cool. What I'm opposed to is lying. All right? I'm opposed to just fabricating material. and then like making a living off of it. I'm opposed to that. It's just wrong. But again, I don't want people to take Mike's word for it. I want people to go look at the primary text. I show people, look, here's where you get the primo Akkadian dictionary. It's the University of Chicago project. It's like 30 volumes. They're all in PDF. They're all free. Here's the volume where you can look up Nibiru. Here's the volume where you can look up this or that or the other thing. Go look, and you'll find out that I'm telling you the truth. I mean, when I went on Coast to Coast, this is like 2003. And Art Bell asked, would you debate Zecharia Sitchin? Well, sure, I said, but, Art, it's never going to happen. I mean, he's nothing to gain through this. But Art wanted to ask, and I said, yeah. And it never did happen because he does have nothing to gain. He did have nothing to gain through it. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look, I don't care what you say. I want you to show us all the primary texts for what you're saying. Because I know that the claims you're saying literally do not exist. Now, if I was wrong, how easy would it be to demonstrate that I'm wrong and make Mike go away? All you got to do is produce one. And nobody since 2003 has produced one. Why? Because it doesn't exist. Now, we can talk about extraterrestrials. I love the subject. The fiction I write, revolves around the subject. I combine ancient texts and ET stuff and conspiracies. I love that stuff. It's fun. It's interesting. It's stimulating. So I don't object to any of that. I enjoy it. But what I object to is just making crap up. I mean, that's what gets me. And if people don't like it, I'm sorry. But you deserve someone at some point in your journey who will just tell you the truth. You are worth telling the truth to. And I'm telling you the truth.
Other thing, too, that I was going to ask is with some of these texts that are written about, also these seals, what do those represent in Revelations? Do you know?
Oh, boy. Yeah. The short answer is no.
Okay. Sure.
There are questions like, okay, because you have sealed judgments, you got trumpet judgments, you got bowl judgments. Should we understand them as being consecutive? Should we understand them as being three versions of the same thing? In other words, they're concurrent. And, the honest truth is people don't know. They guess, they try out different systems and whatnot. I mean, loosely speaking, what they are is judgments upon the earth. And that much is transparent if you just read through the book of Revelation. But if you want to know, what things either in our current historical circumstances or historical circumstances of the past or historical circumstances of the future are these going to correspond to? I don't know, and neither does anybody else. It's just judgment language that is, cast in a certain way. So, I'm just gonna tell people I don't know. You're not going to get a date out of me. I could make one up, but I'm not going to do that.
What about the mark of the beast?
The mark of the beast, I think, actually is a little more knowable, at least in conceptual terms. I mean, John tells us that, that the mystery isn't the number, obviously, because he gives us the number, but he says this is the number of a man, or you could also translate it, this is a human number.
Right.
And 666 is the dominant manuscript tradition. There are manuscripts that have the number at 616. So some of this, again, the direction that you go off on this really depends on a couple of things. One is, do you think that the book of Revelation, was written before or after 70 AD? I believe it was written after. There are reasons I don't need to rabbit trail on why, and I'm with the majority there. But there are some people who want it, to be written before, and so they like, since that's their view, they like to align the number with Nero, because Nero is the only person, and he's a tyrant, so he kind of fits a little bit of the beast profile. He persecuted Christians and whatnot. But Nero is the only historical person of the period that, depending on how you write his name, either in Latin, Greek, or Aramaic, his is the only name that can account for both numbers by gematria. And for your listeners probably know what gematria is, but gematria was the practice in some languages. And Hebrew is one, Greek's another. I mean, a number of different languages do this. They use certain letters of the alphabet for numeric values. And so when you have a number, you can retrovert it into letters. When you have letters, you can do it the other direction into numbers. And Nero's name and titles is the only one that can account for both numbers. Now, is that correct? Or I don't know. I actually think there's a better kind of approach to this, but I'm just telling you I'm predisposed because of what I think about the date of revelation. But a lot of people think that 666 needs to be understood in terms of magic squares. And I think there's something to this. Now, a magic square is, for anybody who does Sudoku, you know what a magic square is. You have the same, you have a bunch of numbers in a box, and the number, the sum total across the top, down the side, and then diagonally, adds up to the same thing. And so the magic square that produces the number 666, you have 111 across the top, 111 on each of the sides. So that's 4 of them, and then 2 diagonal. They all equal 111 times 6 is 666. That is the magic number for the sun. And you say, well, big deal. Well, then you have to ask yourself, well, who was the sun associated with? Well, in Greco-Roman period, that was Zeus. But prior to Greco-Roman period, in the Semitic world, that was Baal, who is the Satan figure. Baal-Zebul, Canaanite literature, Prince Baal. Baal-Zebul is one of the names of Satan in the New Testament. I mean, you got to put these things together. And so I think that the point of the number is to identify the beast either with Satan or as Satan, or again, some person that's empowered by Satan. You say, well, Mike, I could have got that just by reading Revelation 13. Yeah, you could have. So in other words, 666 just sort of is a numerical reinforcement of what you can read in the text. I actually think that that's probably the better way to go, because it makes sense within its context. It uses gematria. It uses the magic square approach. So I think that's knowable. But then you have to ask yourself, well, who would the historical person be that would be aligned with the solar deity or Satan, the Satan figure, or whatever? And the answer is, well, I don't know. It just depends when this plays out.
Now, also, what is your definition of Satan?
I think Satan is a divine being. He's this would take us into the whole Elohim talk. The Bible has multiple Elohim in it, which is Elohim is one of the standard words for God. It's not polytheism, because the term Elohim in Semitic thinking has nothing to do with a unique set of attributes. See, when we see the letters G, O, and D on a piece of paper or on a screen, our brains, because we're Westerners, because we sort of grew up in the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, when we see the letters G-O-D, our brain immediately assigns a specific set of attributes to it, like omniscience, omnipresence, almighty, and all this kind of stuff. And so that's why it creeps people out when you put an S on the end. Well, the biblical writers did not think that way about the word Elohim. And you say, well, Mike, how do you know that? Well, we know that because of the Bible. If you actually look up, go through the thousands of occurrences of Elohim, you'll find out that Elohim is actually used of half a dozen different entities that are not all the God of Israel. So that tells us it's not about attributes, because the Yahweh, the God of Israel, is an Elohim, but he is described in ways that no other Elohim are. He is distinguished in specific ways. So there's only one of him. So that's the whole idea behind monotheism, even though the term is kind of clunky when it comes to what an ancient Semite is thinking. But you have a bunch of Elohim. And Elohim is it's a term you would use to describe any being who by nature is disembodied and lives in the spirit world. And so the Satan figure is one of those. So Satan is an Elohim. He's a divine being. That's the way he's cast. He has personality, personhood. He had a fall. He had a rebellion against the authority of Yahweh, again, who is species unique. He is unique among Elohim in various ways. So I take him as a person, not just an abstract or a force or something like that. But I'll say this as well. This is going to set me apart from a lot of the Christian tradition. I don't think Satan is any more powerful than lots of other Elohim. I think he gets sort of primary status, not because he's more powerful, but because he was the original rebel. He has street cred among other rebels for being the first to dare to try to usurp the authority of the God of the Bible. So I think that's why he is, again, sort of, the lead villain, if you want to call it that way, or call it that in biblical thinking.
Do you think that he has an influence really powerful over the world today?
I think, well, theologically, he certainly does, because he is the Lord of the dead. In biblical theology, the original rebel, of course, is cast down to the earth. In Hebrew, it's Eretz, but Eretz is also the word for the underworld in biblical language. So he is cast down instead of being above the Most High and being like the Most High. Isaiah 14. That's the way he's described. He's put beneath everything instead of being above everything. That's his punishment. So he becomes Lord of the dead. He is cast out of heaven. He has to, exist on earth, or actually under the earth in biblical thinking. And that isn't, so bad for us, except, again, in the biblical story, humanity, Adam and Eve, rebelled with him. And so they are driven from Eden. The human race is now separate from God, estranged from God. God is the source of life, and so they will die. They age once they're out of Eden, removed from the tree of life. They will die, and he owns their souls because he is Lord of the dead. And so that the gospel story is the effort of God to redeem humanity, to solve the problem of death, to remove the curse. And the trigger for that is the cross event. Jesus pays the price for all humanity. He dies the death that all humanity should have, does and did deserve. And those who believe that, those who put their faith in that act in biblical theology are saved. They're redeemed. They are relieved from the curse of death. They will be resurrected to life eternal. That's the whole gospel message in biblical thinking. So Satan is a key factor, because he necessitates all of that, because it has to be remedied. God does not give up on humanity after they fall. As far as day-to-day influence, no, I think we screw up our lives just fine on our own. I don't think we need Satan behind every human being, nudging us to be wicked, or nudging us to harm other people, nudging us to be, crassly selfish, and all the other things that humans do to mess up their lives. I think we do that just fine on our own. Does he have an influence in what happens on earth? I think, yeah, we'd have to say, again, in biblical theology, the answer to that is yes, as well. Again, but in a general sense, we're not told specifics. But biblical thinking connects heaven and earth. As in heaven, so on earth. What happens in the heavens, the spiritual realm, affects what happens on earth. And what happens on earth gets a good deal of attention in the spiritual world, because their destinies are tied together. And so, since Satan is one of the main characters in that drama, what he does certainly, will have a ripple effect. We're just not told what's on the agenda specifically at any given point.
And have you noticed also that if you look at the entertainment industry,
Oh yeah,
so many people brag about how they sold their soul to the devil,
yeah.
and that's how they made fame and fortune. And whether they did or didn't, or they think they did, or it just subconsciously gives them this extra kick, I don't know. But what's your take on that?
I'm kind of with you there. I think that, to be honest, there's no way to actually know. I think a lot of it is, this sort of, some people say that for shock value. Some people, I think, really are trapped by this conscious or subconscious thought, and then they behave in a certain way. But I'm not willing to rule out, that some of those people can be used as tools by intelligent evil. Again, but I don't have this big view of Satan that everything wicked that happens in the world is somehow directly tied to him. There are lots of rebellions in the Bible, again, in biblical thinking. Satan is far from the only bad guy. He's far from the only one with influence. And frankly, humanity has been corrupted, again, as part of divine rebellions that contributes to the condition of humanity. And so lots of human evil is just purely human. But again, since I do believe that there is this thing called the spirit world, and we have these beings in it, and I'm not a materialist, I think that there could be, you could have cases where, we're imagining here, out loud, where Satan could look at someone and say, that person's a useful tool. If they want to act this way, or they want to solicit, my involvement, or, quote unquote, sell their soul, theologically, that's kind of a vacuous concept, because there's no way that you have power over your own eternal destiny if God wants to break in, okay, and God, actively tries to break in, but God didn't create us robots. There is this thing called genuine free will in biblical thinking. But for you to think that you overpower God's desire to love you and save you is just nonsense. It's theological nonsense. But nevertheless, people act that way and they think that way, and they might be a useful tool. Who knows? Ultimately, we just don't.
Now, I mean, do you think that Jesus Christ is the actual savior of humankind?
I do, and it's only because, to me, that is the theological narrative that makes the most sense. People ask all the time, well, what's the difference between Christianity and everything else? Let me first say that what gets marketed as Christianity today in the modern world, and really, not just now, but for a long, long, long time, I think is basically, I hate to say it this way, but people going through the motions, people using the name of Christ, and having no real attachment to it, having false theology, false goodness, false works, basically hypocrisy. I distinguish what gets portrayed and marketed as Christianity from what the New Testament actually says is Christianity. So if we talk about that, okay, what distinguishes that from everything else? Every religion has, every religion at least that acknowledges that there's true evil and humanity needs to be saved from something itself, its evil nature, whatever, sin, whatever you want to call it. Every one of them says, well, the solution to this spiritual problem, the solution to being rightly related to this deity, this God that we believe demands holiness and perfection, the solution to that is you just have to work real hard. Essentially, you got to do enough to take care of your own problem. And I consider that absurd, because we are not perfectible in our own power. I don't care what you call your religion. If you think that you can be perfected, if you think that you're perfectible, that you can perform well enough to be like, again, this God that you say you want to please, good luck with that. Christianity is the only one that affirms the obvious, that is just never going to happen. It's absurd and it's impossible. Because the message of biblical Christianity is, look, you're under judgment here, and God knows that you can't solve this problem yourself. Therefore, he is going to become a man in Christ, and he will pay your penalty for you. It's the only thing that can help you. But what God asks in return is not that you perform, okay, because it has nothing to do with human perfection. What God asks instead is that you believe. You believe that he loves you enough to do this, and you put your faith in that, and God will call it good. Okay, that is biblical Christianity. It's none of these rituals. It's not, works and perfection oriented. If you want that, pick another religion. But again, good luck with that, because when you really think about it, what in the world are you doing? You can't be perfect. You can't do that. You're not going to be at the level of the holiness of this God that you think you need to please. It's an absurdity, but that's what every other religion offers you. And so I think that biblical Christianity is the only one that is honest, recognizes the absurdity of this proposition, and says the only solution to this is if God takes care of it for you.
There's also a lot of people that feel if you don't believe in Jesus as your Savior, then you're going to spend eternity in hell, and there's a lot of different thoughts on what hell is. What's your take on that?
I think there's two possibilities, for the biblical concept of hell. I mean, the traditional one, yeah, you can argue the traditional one from the text. I mean, you can build a good case that, hell is this forever condition, where people who reject the grace of God, reject this thing that God does on their behalf, basically, give him the finger. And God doesn't turn around and hate them for it. God is sad because it's like, well, look, this is the solution, and I wish you would take it. But if you don't take it, this is where you're going to go. If you don't choose life, you're going to get death. And so you can look at that and say, well, then they experience death over and over and endlessly, and the endless fire and all that kind of stuff. Honestly, you can argue that from the New Testament. But there is another possibility. Because the book of Revelation, when it's describing the final judgment, the whole hell thing, it actually says that death itself is destroyed in the lake of fire. And Paul in 1 Corinthians says the same thing. 1 Corinthians 15, the last enemy, I think it's chapter 15, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Now here's the question. How can hell be eternal if death itself is done away with? How can you keep dying when there is no more death? And what I'm articulating here is the other position is known as annihilation. In other words, if you choose to give God the finger when it comes to the gospel, you're not going to end up in hell burning forever. When you die, that's it. It's annihilation. You're done. You experience eternal death. That's it. You don't get to experience eternal life. So that also, again, based on those two passages, can actually be argued, pretty cogently from the New Testament. So those are the two positions I think are the most workable. Again, if we're trying to get our theology from the biblical text, you're ultimately probably going to land in one of those two file drawers there. If you want to, again, have a textually based theology.
Okay. And what is divine counsel?
Divine counsel is an academic term, but it's also a biblical term. Comes from Psalm 82 and some other passages. It's really a term for the heavenly host, those divine beings, who work with God, who participate in God's governance of the spiritual world, but also participate in the governance of our world as well. So people tend to think of it as angels. It's not a very precise term. Angel is basically a job description in biblical thinking, biblical Hebrew, malach, messenger, angelos in Greek, messenger. So it's a pretty vast subject. I mean, I just published a book through Lexham Press called The Unseen Realm, and the subtitle is what gets people: Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible, which of course implies that it's been lost, and I do believe it has been lost. And this is one of those subjects because a lot of what people think they know about angels and demons, a lot of what Christians say they know about angels and demons, comes from places like Milton's Paradise Lost or Puritan writers. It doesn't come from the Bible. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is I'm trying to show people that if you really read this thing like an ancient Israelite would read it, because those are the people who wrote the thing, or a first century Jew, what you would think about the supernatural world is actually a lot different than sort of what you grew up in or grew up with, or what you might hear in church. So divine counsel is one of those terms. I mean, people have never heard of it. And you go to Psalm 82 and it says, look, Elohim Nitzav Ba'adat El, God, Elohim, and we know it's singular there because Nitzav is a singular participle. Sorry for the grammar there, but sometimes it's important. But, God takes his stand in the Ba'adat El, in the divine counsel, the counsel of El, the counsel of God. And then the next part of the verse says, B'kerev Elohim Yishpot. In the midst of the Elohim, he passes judgment. So that Elohim has to be plural. So you have God, again, conducting affairs with other Elohim. And people say, well, that's a pantheon. That's polytheism. It's not, again, going back to our earlier discussion, it's not polytheism because Elohim has nothing to do with a set of attributes. It's a generic term that you would use of any being that lives in the spiritual world. Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh in biblical thinking. He is species unique. But his uniqueness is not telegraphed by the word Elohim. His uniqueness is telegraphed by what's said about him that isn't said about the other Elohim.
Okay. Yeah, that's, I'll tell you, your website, it looks like you've updated it now. There's a new one, drmsh.com.
Yeah, that's so clever. It's DR for doctor and my initials. I mean, my website used to be michaelsheiser.com. Nobody could spell it. It's just so dumb. So yeah, that drmsh.com. Hopefully that helps people. But I mean, you can imagine. I mean, there's lots of things on there. I'm hoping people pick up on this. Look, I I I remember being on Coast to Coast once and being referred to as the equal opportunity offender. And yeah,
Nice.
there is some of that. There is some of that. I can't, the kind of stuff that I do and that I say is stuff you're not going to hear in church. And frankly, it freaks people out in a number of respects. But when I was in grad school, I just, again, through a whole set of experiences, I actually remember consciously telling myself, it is not your job to protect people from their own Bible. If they assign importance to this thing, if they say it's the Word of God, if they assign sacred status to it, then they deserve to know what's in it. And it should not be filtered and mediated through tradition. And I have lost friends over that. I have lost jobs over that. But I think it's important, again, because if we do, again, assign sacred status to this or any high view of this document, we ought to let it speak. And that's what I try to do. I try to direct people to primary texts, whether it's the Bible or some ancient Near Eastern text. I like to encourage people to, hey, just read the thing. I can get you tools. I'll get you articles or whatever to help you, on this topic. I'll post some. I'll send you some in email, whatever it is. I try to get people back to primary texts and not taking some authority figure's word for it, whether that be on the church side or whether that be on the lecture circuit of someone who just wants to sell books making stuff up. I object to it on all sides. And you can imagine I'm kind of used to going into places and having people look at me like I got two heads. But I'm okay with that because if you're really interested in the material and you follow the advice I'm trying to give you, you'll enjoy it. You really will. I mean, the ancient texts are interesting. They're fun. When it comes to the Bible, I mean, it takes on a spiritual significance too, and that's good. It's good to sort of read the thing again for the first time.
One of the things that I was going to bring up earlier in the show, and I just completely forgot, I'm remembering now, there's a lot of paintings that were, Renaissance era, also 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and I'm looking at a few of them now. And I'll also give you the names here in a minute, but one is the Madonna with Saint Giovanna, I think is the pronounced properly, from the 15th century.
Hmm.
And this is an Italian Renaissance painter that put this together. And you can see up in the right corner what looks like what most people would say today is your typical flying saucer. Then there's
Hmm.
another painting.
Yeah, and they would be hopelessly wrong. Your timing is impeccable with this. Just I actually blog this. I try to blog this once a year. And on April 9th, just a few days ago, I posted something on my website under the UFO religions column called UFOs in Medieval and Renaissance Art. Stop believing nonsense. And this is my annual ode to the work of art historian Diego Cuoji, who, if you go to this link I blogged and you click on Diego's website, most of it's in English, but he is an art historian that has taken up the cause here, basically to correct this nonsense. What he does is he has dozens, probably hundreds of examples on his website of what these objects are, because they follow well-known patterns to art historians. And in some cases, some of the paintings you actually mentioned, he's been able, again, because he has access to the materials, he's been able to take higher resolution photographs. Like those UFOs, and some of them, they're actually rings of angels. You can see the little faces again. Because what you usually see on the internet are poor photographs or something that somebody's cropped from some other JPEG image. And you don't get the detail. Well, when you get the detail, you realize, oh, this isn't a flying saucer. It's a circle of angels. There are their wings, there are their little faces, and stuff like that. These are stock elements in medieval art. The thing that some people think is a red flying saucer is actually a hat. And Kurogi has dozens of examples of it. So this is the best website on the internet for this stuff. It's an art historian who cares. Because, I'll be honest with you. Most scholars, most academics, and I'm not saying this is a good thing. I actually think it's a bad thing. But most scholars and academics, when they look at stuff like this, they just laugh. They think it's a waste of their time to get involved. I have people in biblical studies when I go to academic conferences that ask me, "What are you doing? Why do you go on these shows? Why do you blog this stuff? This is just a waste of time." And I've actually had people tell me these people are not worth your time. And I just think that's horrible, because I think that scholars should serve the public interest. You watch the History Channel, you watch these shows, and they say the dumbest things because they're like, oh, look at this object. Scholars and scientists are mystified by this. They don't know what to say. No, actually, there's a dozen articles on that are not publicly accessible on the internet, because you have to pay for access to journal databases to get the research on that thing that you think no one's ever seen before. I know that because I'm an academic. I have access to these databases. And my gripe with the people in my sort of community, the humanities or the hard sciences, is that, look, you people need to be taking the time to give people better material to look at. Don't laugh at them. Don't, degrade them or portray yourself as superior or something like that. You should get involved. You should help. You should do something positive. And Kuogi I don't really know of any other art historian who has bothered to go and track down all of these paintings and saying, no, that it's not a saucer, it's this, and here are 20 other examples of it. This is not a mystery. This is not flying saucers in Renaissance art. It's something else. And if you want to know what the something else is, go to drmsh.com, click on the link and then follow Kuogi's link. You can Google him. His name's hard to, it's Cuoghi, first name Diego. That one's easy. But, it's just another example of here we go with just somebody who thinks they found something and thinks it's a mystery and assigns some meaning to it that people in the field look at it and go, holy cow, this is just ridiculous. But instead of helping, instead of becoming part of the conversation, they just ignore it. They just say, it's not worth it. It's not worth my time. God forbid that I should interact with the unwashed masses. I think you can tell I really despise that kind of attitude, within the academic guild, but I see and run into it personally all the time. And it's just a shame. It's just a shame.
It's funny. I'm looking at your website right now, and there's the section of it, Aliens Debunked, and on the right corner there, you've got this big headline that says, AA debunking updates. We will send you an email when we put out new debunkings. I think that's great, man.
Where does it say that?
This is on your website right now.
On my site?
Yeah.
I'm on my website now. Where is that?
On ancientaliensdebunked.com.
Oh yeah, well that's not my website.
That's not your.
No.
What?
I have a link to it from my website.
That's it. Okay, I got you.
See, I'm in the Ancient Aliens Debunked documentary.
That's why.
The
Okay.
one on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's a website run by a guy named Chris White who created the film.
Okay.
And I'm in the film for people who are. It's free. You can watch it on YouTube. It's 3 hours long. But if you go to Ancient Aliens Debunked, and I think people should, because if you don't want to sit there and watch 3 hours, what Chris has done on the site is he's all of the individual segments in video, cut up. You only have to watch a few minutes at a time. So it's worth viewing it that way. But that video has like 5 million views on YouTube, and it's there for free. And I think he did a decent job. It's not, it's not History Channel quality because it's just him. It's just one guy. But I'm in it the last third of it, something like that. Like if the last hour, I'm in there somewhere. But no, that's his site. It's not mine.
Oh, very cool. Okay, yeah, that's why what happened was when I went to your site, once again, drmsh.com, there's a section there that I linked on because you've got a whole bunch of articles. So, yeah, that's great. And beautiful website as well. Whoever put it together for you did a fantastic job.
Well, he will be gratified to hear that. And it wasn't me. I don't have any idea. This was actually done free for me. Somebody who follows my work like 3 years ago sent me an email and said, "Hey, I've read all your stuff and I love your work, but your website sucks. And this is what I do for a living." And he does a pro bono project every year, and he said, "This year it's going to be you." And so I said, "Hey, here are the keys to the kingdom. You want to do it? Go ahead." And yeah, I couldn't touch this. Just trust me. There's just no way.
One thing with web developers, it seems like I've noticed, they're kind of like mechanics. You're very lucky if you find a good one that you can trust.
There's a lot of truth to that. There really is. It's a lot more than just the surface look.
It really is. And it's really nice, too, because you've just got a lot of articles and information for people that, follow your work. And it looks like, is your book are your books available directly on your website and Amazon? Is it better to go to Amazon or just to your website? What would you prefer?
It's probably better to just go up to Amazon. I mean, you can find, like if you go to drmsh.com and you hover over the Naked Bible tab, that's the name of one of my podcasts. At the bottom, Unseen Realm. I mean, you can get to the book, but if you don't really know what they are by title, it's probably just better to go up to Amazon and put my name in the search field. Or since I mentioned the Unseen Realm, if you type that in with my last name, you'll find it real easily.
Okay, great. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. I appreciate you staying up late with us here at the Leak Project, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to talk to you again sometime.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. It was our pleasure. You have a fantastic evening.
You too.